Good afternoon. It's an honor for me to be here today with you. I'd like to thank the university for inviting me. I just realized that the school and I share the same age. But the similarity ends here because unlike the school, I cannot claim that I spent all of my 44 years in excellence. So congratulations, 44 is a big time. And I see from the quality of your teachers, students, and the ambitions you have that there is more to come. I'd like to congratulate all those who have received their recognitions today. That's a big deal. Whatever we do, we love to be appreciated. And finally, I'd like to thank Sandra for her generous words. I come from one edge of Europe to another. So you have an ocean. Unfortunately, we don't have an ocean. We have Russia. And as much as I wish there was an ocean on Ukraine's border, as much eastern border, as much as you have the ocean on your western border, our history is different. Our modernity is different. But what brings us together is this word, Europe, because we are all Europeans. And I appreciate the proposal that came from the university to speak about Ukraine war and Europe's defining decade. I'm afraid it will take more time than a decade, but for the purpose of brevity and clarity, which university walls tend to appreciate, I think we can use the word decade as a reference point. So let me share with you the view of Europe, its today and its future, that you may disagree with or agree, but that is also part of the European vision that comes from the East, not from the North, not from the South, or from the West of Europe, but from its East. And the story, in my view, starts before the creation of the first European communities. It starts with Europe's imperial experience. Because when the war ended, when the Second World War ended, major European nations were still empires. Some of them did not have the term in the name anymore, but they still had colonies and they had policies. And they were willing to continue. But they clearly came to a decision by the end of the Second World War that things in Europe have to be done differently. It just cannot last like this because we are killing each other, we are destroying each other, we are undermining each other and making each other weaker. As we know, you cannot jump from one way of thinking to another in a blink of an eye. So what happened, in my view, is this. The imperial approach shifted from being outward to inward. And people ask themselves, some prominent minds ask themselves a question. Well, they didn't, but that's how I imagine they were thinking. Like, what if we try to build a first ever liberal empire? And again, there is nothing to be ashamed of in the word, neither in the word liberal, nor in the word of empire, because we are talking about definitions, not practices here. So what if an empire will be built on voluntary participation instead of coercion? What if empire will be built on fair distribution of resources and benefits and not on extraction? What if empire will be built on the rule of law and not on the rule of force? And finally, what if we build an empire that will respect every identity as equal? So these were all the differences, but there is one thing that remains intact when we speak of a concept of empire. It is the concept of enlargement. And this is why Europe began to expand immediately. And I agree with Paolo, my dear colleague. I am his former colleague. He mentioned about the acceptance of Greece, for example, to the European Union. We heard a lot about the merit-based approach to enlargement, but enlargement was always political, and Greece is the best example of that. With all my respect to Greece. But how can you build a united Europe without having a cradle of European philosophy, which is Greece, as part of the project? You cannot. So enlargement was always political. It was also the case in the early 90s. In 1992, when the Soviet Union split up, Europe faced a very difficult choice. It had to decide where its next border will be. Should it stay where it was? Should it expand? If expand, how far? And in 1992, the decision was made that Central European nations and Baltic nations will be integrated into the body of United Europe, and their eastern border will become a new border of Europe. The Balkan Wars postponed the issue of expansion to the southeast, but when it came to designating a place for countries like Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova in this new vision of Europe, the frame was identified clearly. Ukraine was given a role of a part of a Russian world that has to remain friendly to the West. It made perfect sense back then. Ukraine was seen as a rebel part of Russia. It was too big, too strong, with potential that was too big to ignore. So you don't want to have an enemy like that on your border. You want that country to be friendly to you. And this was the niche, or the place that Ukraine was given. There was not a single moment between 1992 and 2022, which is exactly 30 years, right? I'm not good at math. I particularly admire a professor of mathematics who was recognized today. So 30, yes? 30 years. European the view that Ukraine belongs to the Russian world remained unchallenged among European political elites for 30 years. Now, at this particular moment, let me highlight another aspect of Europe's development. To be able to focus on big, ambitious projects, you have to solve two fundamental problems: the issue of your security and the issue of resources. If you do not solve these problems, you cannot build, you cannot develop, you cannot do something big, bigger than you currently are. Europe found a beautiful way to solve both problems. Security was delegated to the United States, and cheap resources came from the Soviet Union and then Russia. And this was a big part, these two actors were a big part of Europe's success. Everything we see today in Europe is a product of European ambition supported by the United States as provider of security and Russia as provider of raw energy. And then Europe thought that it doesn't have to enlarge anymore because everything is fine. Roles were assigned. Western Balkans were promised, the war in the Western Balkans ended, they were promised the membership, but for 10-something years, nothing really happened. And to the extent that it became a mauvais ton, as the French say, to speak about enlargement at all. In 2023, when my former colleague, Annalena Baerbock, Foreign Minister of Germany, hosted a conference in Berlin dedicated to EU enlargement, she started her opening remarks by saying, if I had held this conference 3 years ago, I would have been fired the next day only because I was speaking about enlargement. All of this ended in 2022. All of a sudden, it became clear that the borders of Europe probably do not end where we thought they did. And raw energy, cheap energy from Russia was gone. Was not an option anymore because it was weaponized by Russia. So the war in Ukraine, a tragedy for the people of Ukraine, should also be viewed from the perspective of how the wheels of history are turning. So first, cheap energy was gone. Second, Europe came to realize that Ukraine belongs to it. And then, 3 years later, security was gone. Because the United States, as it turned out, got tired of bearing the main burden of European defense. So the moment two main factors that allowed Europe to become what it is were gone, the moment the shock of war made Europe realize that Ukraine is not a part of the Russian world, but a part of Europe, the path to a completely new Europe has been defined. This is where it all started. Books and dissertations, first dissertations and then books, will be written about 2022 as the year when history of Europe changed forever. This was the moment when everyone came to realize that things must be done differently. I would like to commend Europe for finding the strength to look at reality without rose glasses. The decisions that Europe has taken over the last 4 years were landmark. These were true breakthrough. In fact, I think no one expected, even the Europeans themselves did not expect to perform that well. Of course, there is nothing easier in life than criticizing the European Union. Probably only if you decide to criticize the United Nations. But we should be fair. Europe has done a remarkable job. And the big challenge, the big decision that has to be taken is not a decision of what to do with Ukraine, with Moldova, with Balkans. It's a decision on how to do it in the most appropriate way and as soon as possible. I'm certain that you know history of European Union better than I do. But it seems to me that the idea of enlargement reinvigorated the project of a large Europe. It seems to me that the moment Europe forgets about enlargement, puts enlargement on hold, on the shelf, it begins to drown in its internal problems. Enlargement, as it was always the case with any imperial thinking, enlargement is the purpose that motivates, that allows you to focus, that concentrates resources on achieving a big historic mission. And this is what is happening right as we speak, because we see that there are difficulties in finding the ways, but no one questions the mission, that Europe needs to enlarge. And I believe there is one more important explanation to that, the defining explanation. Finally, it seems Europe has come to realize that in a competitive world, every space you leave empty will be filled in by someone else. And that someone else will not be a friend. By the moment the European Union came to the conclusion that the enlargement to Western Balkans has to be reinvigorated, it came to realize that powers like China or Russia already set their foot into this region. I'm not even speaking about Ukraine now. So the logic of the competitive world, and competitive world is a diplomatic version of saying a world of wars, is this: you have to expand if you want to be safe and prosperous. You have to bring your rules, your values, your bonds to the place that you want to be a source of engagement and not confrontation. So the logic of enlargement makes perfect sense now. But the question is, of course, what has to change to get it done and how to do it the right way? Everyone speaks about merit-based approach. That's a very good thing. Merit-based approach is an excellent approach. The problem with the rules of enlargement adopted by the European Union on the basis of a merit-based approach were meant to avoid enlargement, not to conduct enlargement. They were written in a way that enlargement would never happen. So now they have to be reconsidered. Secondly, it has become apparent over the last years, even with this number of members of the European Union, that the decision-making process stumbles. The bigger you grow, the more difficult it gets to adopt decisions by consensus. So when we speak about merit-based approach, we speak about reforms of a candidate. But when we speak about the decision-making process that needs to be reformed in order for the European Union to enlarge, we also speak about the reform of the European Union. And here comes the paradox. Ukraine spent decades reforming itself, trying to get closer to the European Union, to end up in a situation where it will take Ukraine less time to reform itself to meet merit-based criteria than the European Union to reform itself, to be able to absorb new members. And this is where we currently, this is the problem that everyone is looking a solution for. And the second problem that stands in the way to enlargement is, when it comes to Ukraine, is our agriculture. Unfortunately, Ukraine's agriculture is so big that it is incompatible with common EU agricultural policy. This is very, very big problem that needs to be resolved. No one wants farmer revolutions and farmer wars again, to see them again in Europe. The next decade will also be divided. So the next decade in Europe will be defined by, in my view, three factors. The first is the enlargement. How quick and how painless will the enlargement be? That's a big if, but solutions must be found for the sake of Europe. Secondly is how will Europe ensure its security? The United States are not going to leave NATO, in my view, but I believe that American soldiers are not going to die for Europe if the war breaks out. And it's a big issue because the whole promise of NATO was based on that American soldiers will fight shoulder to shoulder with the European soldiers. The second problem on the security track for Europe is that while the United States will remain in NATO, they will also continue to exercise their leverage on the development of European defense industries and capabilities. When the United States are asking Europe to spend more money on defense, they do not imply that all of this money will be spent on European weapons. They imply that a big chunk of this money will be spent on American weapons. And this is where European leadership will face a dilemma. How do you ensure strategic autonomy in relationship with the partner you cannot fully trust and rely on if your weapons, your state-of-the-art weapons, critically depend on that partner? And this is where the third driver of the future of Europe comes from. It's technology. A lot will depend on how successful Europe will be in developing itself as a world center of technological advancement. Everyone talks about AI, but of course it is far beyond that. It is far bigger than that. And so when you look at these three factors, which I believe will be detrimental for the future of Europe and will define Europe as Europe's role on world stage, Ukraine becomes indispensable for all three of them. Enlargement as a driving force, as the way to create a safe Europe along its perimeter. Security, because I don't even have to talk about that. It doesn't matter how good I highly respect every army in Europe and the world, except the Russian one, of course. But it doesn't matter how good your army are. A bad army with battle experience is better, by definition, than a good army without battle experience. It's a rule. And when it comes to technology, military technology, the state-of-the-art military technology today is in Ukraine. It's not in Germany, it's not in France, with all my respect to big companies who claim they produce state-of-the-art weapons. They do, but this is They're far away from meeting the needs of the front line, let me put it this way. This technology is in Ukraine, and Europe needs that technology. And what we've seen recently is that after a decade of efforts, pretty successful, but it took a decade to bring Ukraine closer to the common market of the European Union. Then within only 2 years, Ukraine's defense industry became an integral part of European defense industry. Everything is possible when there is a will. And that will was born in 2022. But nothing changes in a blink of an eye. It takes time. It takes obstacles to be overcome. It takes effort to be made. And we are in that very middle of the process of overcoming these obstacles on the path to purposes, to ambitions that we as Europeans have set for ourselves. And the alternative is simple. Either Europe succeeds in enlarging, providing for its security and developing its own technologies, and remains a global actor, or if it fails, it will have to descend from the world scene. It will still be a nice place to live, don't worry. But it will not be a player in global affairs, probably for the first time in history. Maybe it's not bad for the world. You know, Europe was never was not always the best player. But we have to understand that if Europe is off the stage, it becomes a game for those who remain on the stage. So if we fail in achieving these goals, first will be gone security and then prosperity. I understand that from today's perspective, things may not look that way, but this is what history teaches us. I therefore always encourage everyone to believe in Europe, to contribute to Europe's success, and to remember one thing: the strongest asset Europe has is unity. Unity is fundamental. In a very interesting manner, this is manifested in the war that my country goes through. The only reason, 2 reasons actually, there are only 2 reasons why President Trump has not succeeded in imposing his will neither on Ukraine nor on Europe. And the first reason is because we Ukrainians are crazy people. And the second reason is because we and the rest of Europe, we stay united. Every week I'm being asked a question: what if Trump makes a deal with Putin? What if Trump decides to send Ukraine down the drain? I say 2 things. First, one thing that brings, among many things, one thing that brings President Trump and Putin together is that they both genuinely despise Europe. They just despise it. They just don't want it to be a player. And second, even if they make a deal based on this mutual attitude, they may make a deal. I'm not saying they can't. They may make a deal. But they will not be able to enforce it. Because as long as Ukraine and the rest of Europe stand together as long as we continue to invest in our defense, in getting stronger, this is how we deprive them of a leverage on us. Yes, our life may be more complicated, but no one will be able to break us down. So this unity between Ukraine and the European Union, until Ukraine becomes a part of the European Union, is actually a great security guarantee for both Ukraine and Europe and the European Union. And this is another reason why we should appreciate the relationship that we have, that is manifested in so many ways, starting from big politics and ending with my presence today here at the University of Minho, which I greatly appreciate. Thank you.